Have you ever stopped to wonder what happens the moment someone who always needed to run the show suddenly realizes they're not running anything at all anymore? What happens when the person who acted completely untouchable, endlessly confident, entirely unbothered by anything, finally comes face to face with a reality they never once prepared themselves for? What you're about to hear might genuinely reshape the way you think about narcissistic behavior altogether. Because when most people think about narcissists, they usually imagine the obvious behaviors: arrogance, manipulation, a constant need for attention, or someone who always wants to be admired. Those traits are real patterns that can appear in narcissistic personalities, but beneath the surface, there is often a much more complicated psychological dynamic taking place. The biggest misunderstanding is that narcissistic behavior is only about confidence or superiority. In many cases, what appears to be extreme confidence can actually be connected to a fragile sense of self that depends heavily on external validation. The admiration, attention, control, or emotional reactions they receive from others can become a source of psychological stability. When that source begins to disappear, something unexpected can happen. The person who once seemed completely certain of themselves may begin to feel unsettled. This is why certain moments can affect narcissistic individuals more deeply than people realize. It is not always a dramatic argument, a confrontation, or a powerful speech that creates the biggest impact. Sometimes it is the quiet shift in another person's behavior. A person who no longer reacts the same way, someone who stops chasing approval, stops explaining themselves endlessly, or stops becoming emotionally pulled into the same patterns. That change can create a psychological disruption because the old dynamic no longer works. Many relationships involving narcissistic traits develop around predictable emotional cycles. One person reacts, the other person responds, and over time, both individuals become familiar with their roles. The narcissistic person may expect certain reactions: anger, sadness, reassurance, attempts to fix the situation, or a desire to regain connection. Those responses can unintentionally reinforce the existing pattern because they provide evidence that the person still has emotional influence. But when the pattern changes, the entire system changes. A calm response can be confusing because it does not provide the same emotional information. It does not confirm control, power, or importance in the same way. Instead, it creates uncertainty. The narcissistic individual may begin wondering why the old methods no longer create the same reaction. Why does this person seem different? Why are they no longer responding the way they used to? This moment can reveal something important about human psychology. People often become aware of change not when someone announces it, but when they experience the absence of what used to be there. The missing reaction becomes the message. This does not mean every narcissistic person will respond the same way. Human behavior is complex, and people with narcissistic traits exist on a wide spectrum. Some may attempt to restore the previous connection by becoming more charming, affectionate, or attentive. They may bring back memories, offer kindness, or act in ways designed to recreate the emotional closeness that existed before. Others may respond in the opposite direction. They may become distant, dismissive, or defensive because accepting that they no longer have the same influence can feel uncomfortable. Creating emotional distance can become a way to protect their self-image and avoid facing feelings of rejection or loss. Both reactions come from a similar challenge. The old pattern has been interrupted. One of the most powerful psychological shifts happens when someone stops organizing their life around another person's approval. When someone rebuilds their confidence, creates boundaries, and becomes emotionally grounded, the relationship dynamic transforms. The person who once seemed easy to influence becomes harder to predict, not because they are trying to create confusion, but because they are no longer operating from the same emotional place. And that is often the part that changes everything. The narcissistic individual is no longer interacting with the same version of that person. They are encountering someone who has developed a stronger sense of self, someone who is no longer dependent on receiving validation or closure from them. The deeper lesson is not about defeating or changing another person. It is about understanding how powerful personal growth can be. When someone heals, gains awareness, and stops participating in unhealthy patterns, the entire emotional landscape changes. Sometimes the greatest shift is not what you say, it is what you no longer need to prove. It is the peace that appears when your identity is no longer built around someone else's reaction. And that transformation can be the moment when an entire psychological dynamic begins to collapse and a new chapter begins. Losing control tends to be one of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences a narcissistic person can go through, And that's because control was never just something they happened to enjoy having. It's something they actually depend on to hold their entire sense of security and self-worth together. In most relationships, they get used to knowing exactly how the other person is going to react. They come to expect access, attention, emotional responses, forgiveness, and continued availability, almost as a given. Over time, that predictability starts to feel like power in itself. They begin operating under the assumption that no matter what happens between you, the other person is always going to stay emotionally tied to them and within easy reach. But then someone finally walks away and actually holds firm boundaries, and that whole sense of certainty just vanishes overnight. The narcissistic person suddenly has no way of predicting what the other person is thinking, feeling, or doing anymore. They lose the ability to steer conversations, to trigger the emotional reactions they used to count on, or to shape the story of the relationship the way they always had before. That loss of influence creates real intense discomfort because it strips away a source of psychological stability they may have leaned on for years without even realizing it. What makes all of this particularly hard for them to deal with is that they tend to interpret someone else's independence as a threat rather than as a completely normal part of any human relationship. The second their former partner becomes emotionally unavailable, starts making their own decisions without checking in, and stops seeking their approval altogether, the narcissist is suddenly confronted with a reality they genuinely struggle to accept. They are no longer the center of that person's emotional world anymore. That realization alone can set off frustration, anger, anxiety, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to reestablish contact or somehow regain some kind of influence. Honestly, the distress they feel is usually less about losing love itself, and much more about losing the ability to control access, attention, and emotional outcomes. And when that control disappears, it can end up exposing insecurities and fears that had been sitting hidden underneath a carefully maintained air of superiority for a very long time. A narcissistic sense of identity tends to lean heavily on outside validation, mostly because their sense of self was never as stable or internally grounded as it might appear from the outside. While they might project confidence, certainty, and total self-assurance to everyone around them, a huge portion of that image only gets held up through other people's reactions to them. Praise, admiration, attention, recognition, even emotional responses of any kind, all of it functions as proof that they're important, desirable, powerful, or somehow superior to others. Instead of generating a steady sense of worth from somewhere inside themselves, they end up relying on other people to keep reinforcing that belief over and over again. That dependence on validation tends to bleed into nearly every part of their life. In relationships, they might constantly seek reassurance, admiration, or heavy emotional investment from their partner. In social settings, they can become intensely focused on status, appearance, achievements, or whatever impression they're making on the people around them. Even criticism that would seem pretty minor to most people can feel disproportionately threatening to them simply because it challenges the image they've worked so hard to build and maintain. Positive attention strengthens that image every time, while rejection, indifference, or a drop in admiration can create some genuinely significant emotional discomfort for them. So when a person who used to provide that steady stream of validation finally steps away for good, the narcissist isn't just losing a relationship, they're losing an entire source of psychological reinforcement that had been propping up their self-image the whole time. All of a sudden, the compliments, the attention, the emotional reactions, the constant availability they'd come to count on, none of it is guaranteed anymore. That can trigger some pretty deep feelings of insecurity, anxiety, frustration, or even outright obsession. They might start searching for new sources of validation elsewhere, try to win back the old ones, or become fixated on proving their own value to whoever's around to notice. The deeper issue underneath all of this was never really about simply wanting attention for its own sake. It's about relying on other people's approval just to maintain a sense of identity, significance, and emotional stability in the face of self-doubt that's been sitting there under the surface the entire time. Setting firm boundaries and going completely no contact creates a very specific kind of psychological pressure because it cuts off the exact channels a narcissistic person normally uses to maintain their sense of influence, awareness, and emotional control. In a lot of relationships, they get used to having constant access to the other person's thoughts, feelings, reactions, and everyday life. Whether that's through direct messages, social media updates, mutual friends, or even ongoing conflict, all of those connections feed them information and reassurance that they still hold an important place in that person's world. Even negative reactions from the other side serve a purpose here because they confirm that an emotional connection is still very much alive. Once no contact gets established and actually maintained consistently, that whole flow of information just stops cold. The narcissist no longer knows what the other person is up to, who they're spending time with, how they're feeling, or whether they're thinking about the relationship at all anymore. That uncertainty can become deeply uncomfortable because it creates a complete loss of predictability. The person who once seemed fully accessible suddenly becomes psychologically out of reach, and that lack of access tends to generate a mounting sense of curiosity and frustration over time. The pressure keeps building because silence leaves so much room for unanswered questions to pile up. Without any communication to work with, the narcissist can't easily test their own influence, seek reassurance, defend their image, or shape the story the way they're used to doing. They might start wondering whether they've been forgotten entirely, replaced by someone else, or permanently written out of that person's life for good. The absence of any feedback can actually feel more threatening than a direct rejection would, simply because there's nothing concrete left to respond to or push back against. As a result, no contact often forces them to sit with a level of uncertainty they'd normally go out of their way to avoid. Not being able to monitor, manipulate, persuade, or provoke a response out of someone can trigger anxiety, anger, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to force their way back into contact. The psychological pressure here comes from losing both information and influence at the exact same time, leaving them completely unable to rebuild the familiar dynamic that used to give them their sense of control in the first place. The ego starts to crack open when the carefully built image a narcissistic person has constructed can no longer be consistently backed up by outside reality. So much of their psychological stability depends on holding on to the belief that they're exceptional, desirable, important, or fully in control of everything around them. That self-image usually functions as a kind of protective shield against deeper feelings of inadequacy, insecurity, shame, or vulnerability sitting underneath it. As long as they keep receiving validation, admiration, attention, or compliance from the people around them, that shield stays intact, and the doubts underneath stay mostly hidden from view, including from themselves. But when a major source of that validation gets removed, especially after someone walks away and firmly refuses to come back, cracks can start showing up in that protective structure. The narcissist may start running into evidence that directly contradicts their assumptions about themselves. The person they fully expected to come crawling back simply doesn't. The individual they were sure needed them keeps moving forward just fine on their own. The influence they used to count on becomes less effective or just disappears entirely. These kinds of experiences create a harsh collision between the image they hold of themselves and the reality actually unfolding around them. That internal conflict can be deeply unsettling because it forces them to sit with questions they'd normally avoid at all costs. They're forced to ask themselves why they can't control the situation anymore, if they're really as powerful as they've always believed. They start questioning why someone else seems to be thriving without them in the picture if they were truly as unforgettable as they'd imagined themselves to be. These kinds of questions create real, intense discomfort because they threaten the grandiose self-perception that's been helping them feel secure this whole time. As that pressure keeps building, their emotional reactions tend to get a lot stronger too. You might see mood swings, extreme defensiveness, irritability, obsessive thinking, and a heightened sensitivity to any kind of criticism start to surface. They might try even harder to chase down validation, rewrite the story in their own favor, blame other people for what happened, or scramble to regain some sense of control. Underneath all of that behavior sits a growing struggle to keep their idealized self-image intact, even as the evidence around them keeps chipping away at it, exposing vulnerabilities they've spent years working hard to keep buried out of sight. Certainty tends to give way to obsession once a narcissistic person loses confidence that they still hold influence over someone they always assumed would stay emotionally available to them. During the relationship, they probably felt pretty secure in assuming they understood the other person's feelings, reactions, and future behavior. They often expect that no matter how much distance gets created between them, they'll still occupy some significant space in that person's mind. That certainty gave them a clear sense of control and predictability, and it helped prop up their self-image the whole time. Once that certainty disappears, it leaves behind a pretty deep psychological void. The person who left is no longer responding, explaining themselves, defending their choices, or offering up any kind of emotional feedback at all. Instead of getting the confirmation they're used to that they still matter, the narcissist is left sitting with unanswered questions instead. They might start wondering what the other person is thinking, whether they've moved on completely, whether someone else has taken their place, or whether they're even being thought about anymore at all. That lack of information can become harder and harder to sit with over time. As a result, thoughts about their former partner often become more frequent, more intense, more intrusive. The narcissist might replay old conversations over and over in their head, revisit old memories, pick apart past events, or search for tiny clues that might help explain what actually happened. They might check social media profiles obsessively, ask mutual friends for updates, or build elaborate scenarios in their mind just to fill in the gaps left by all that uncertainty. What used to be a position of total confidence gradually turns into a state of obsession and constant preoccupation. And this obsession isn't necessarily coming from love, emotional intimacy, or any real concern for the other person's well-being. More often than not, it's fueled purely by how deeply uncomfortable it feels to simply not know. Human beings naturally crave closure and understanding, sure, but for someone who leans this heavily on control, uncertainty can feel especially threatening on a deeper level. Not being able to predict, influence, or access another person's inner world turns their confidence into fixation, creating a relentless cycle of rumination that becomes harder and harder to break free from. Jumping into a new relationship often fails to actually fix anything, because a new partner can't automatically resolve the emotional and psychological issues that were already there long before the last relationship ended. A lot of people assume that when a narcissistic person moves on quickly to someone new, it must mean they've fully recovered, forgotten the past, or found something genuinely better. In reality, that new relationship usually ends up serving as nothing more than a temporary source of validation, rather than any kind of real resolution to their deeper insecurities. In the beginning, a new partner might offer up plenty of admiration, attention, excitement, and emotional investment. That can create a powerful sense of relief for the narcissist, because it immediately restores a lot of what they felt they'd lost. The fresh attention reassures them that they're still desirable. The admiration props up their fragile self-image. The novelty of it all distracts them from the painful feelings of rejection, loss, or uncertainty they'd been sitting with. For a while, this dynamic can make everything look perfectly fine from the outside. But the underlying psychological needs that were already there before usually stay completely unchanged underneath it all. The need for constant validation, the fear of losing control, the intense sensitivity to criticism, the total dependence on outside approval, none of that just disappears simply because a new person has entered the picture. As the new relationship becomes more familiar and that initial excitement naturally starts fading, the new partner inevitably turns into an actual flawed human being rather than some idealized source of endless admiration. Differences start showing up, expectations develop, and normal human imperfections become impossible to ignore. When that happens, the exact same insecurities that showed up in previous relationships start resurfacing all over again. The narcissist might start demanding even more attention, grow dissatisfied, or feel genuinely threatened the moment the new partner stops providing constant validation on demand. That replacement relationship was supposed to eliminate their internal discomfort, but because it only ever addressed the surface symptoms rather than the actual root causes, the relief it provides is almost always temporary. The unresolved emotional vulnerabilities stay tucked just beneath the surface the whole time, waiting for the moment that new source of validation stops feeling like enough. Anger and desperation tend to rise together because both emotions are usually coming from the exact same underlying experience, the sudden loss of control, validation, and certainty all at once. When a narcissistic person realizes that someone they used to have real influence over is no longer responding in the predictable ways they'd counted on, they can feel a powerful wave of frustration wash over them. The anger comes from the simple fact that reality has stopped matching their internal expectations. The desperation comes from the growing awareness that their usual playbook for regaining influence just isn't working the way it used to. These two emotional states can exist side by side, creating a confusing, often pretty intense pattern of behavior. That anger usually gets directed outward, toward the person who left. They might blame their former partner, criticize them openly, spread negative stories about them to other people, or paint themselves as the real victim in the whole situation. This kind of reaction helps protect their self-image because it shifts all the responsibility away from themselves and onto someone else instead. Admitting that another person chose to move forward on their own, independently, can be genuinely difficult for them because it directly challenges their core belief in their own importance and influence. At the same time, desperation tends to be operating quietly underneath all of that. The narcissist might become increasingly preoccupied with trying to regain access to the person who left. They might reach out unexpectedly, try to dig up information through mutual friends, keep tabs on social media activity, or look for any possible opening to work their way back into that person's life. These efforts are usually driven by a desperate need to restore certainty and ease the intense discomfort created by the emotional distance between them. Because anger and desperation feed off each other so directly, this emotional cycle tends to intensify over time. The less successful their attempts to regain influence turn out to be, the more frustrated they feel. And the more frustrated they feel, the stronger their urge grows to somehow regain control of the situation. This can lead to some pretty unpredictable swings between hostility, nostalgia, blame, charm, self-pity, and sudden, out-of-nowhere attempts at reconciliation, all of it really just reflecting a deep internal struggle to cope with a reality they find almost impossible to fully accept. The real crisis playing out here is an internal one, because the deepest challenge a narcissistic person actually faces usually isn't the loss of one particular relationship. It's being forced to confront parts of themselves they've spent their entire life carefully avoiding. A lot of narcissistic behavior is specifically designed to protect a fragile sense of self from feelings of inadequacy, shame, rejection, or vulnerability. By focusing heavily on achievement, admiration, status, control, or outside validation, they manage to keep those uncomfortable emotions pushed far into the background where they don't have to look at them. As long as that protective system keeps functioning the way it's supposed to, they rarely feel any real need to examine what's sitting underneath it. But once a major source of validation gets taken away, especially after someone leaves for good and firmly refuses to come back, that protective structure can start to weaken. The attention, admiration, emotional investment, or sense of control that used to hold their internal stability together simply isn't available to them anymore. Without those external supports propping everything up, uncomfortable emotions become a lot harder to keep ignoring. Feelings of insecurity, self-doubt, loneliness, inadequacy, or a deep buried fear can start creeping closer and closer to the surface, whether they're ready to face any of it or not.